Hi, I'm Kent. Let's slipcast some pots. I've been traveling recently, so I haven't had much time in the studio, and running up to that, I've been making a bunch of new molds, and I'm kind of anxious to go ahead and slipcast a bunch of pots and get the finished results. The finished results will come later, but in this video I want to go ahead and turn my liquid slip into some pots. The first thing I want to do is go ahead and get my slip ready. I keep my slip in these buckets here. These are 5-gallon buckets. And I've added spigots to the bottoms of them so I can pour the slip out of it. This is sitting on a motorcycle lift that has an attachment on the end so I can make it go up and down. And right now it's kind of in the middle. I've upgraded one of the spigots so that it can pour the slip out faster. I haven't gotten around to the other one. This is my regular slip. It is straight from the store. All I do is pour in the powder, add water, and the deflocculant. This one here is my reclaimed slip. What I'll do is I'll take all of my bone dry stuff, crush it up, add water, and basically rehydrate it to turn it back into slip. And I don't really worry about if it has colorants or not. So right now this has some iron oxide in it and fires into a bit of a gray. We're not going to be using this today. We're going to be focusing on my normal porcelain-like slip that fires to cone 6. I'm starting with preparing the slip because it's been sitting for several weeks at this point, and I'm sure it has separated out. And slip is also thixotropic, which means it's thicker when it sits, and we want it into a nice fluid consistency and nice and homogenized. So we'll go ahead and mix it up a couple of times. To do that, first I want to drop this down. So I have an attachment for my drill, and there's a little thing down here out of the frame that you can't quite see. I'm just going to go ahead and lower this platform down. So now I can get to the top of the bucket much easier, pull off the lid. The top is not looking so hot. This is all the water that's separated. And I just have an attachment for my drill that I'll use to mix things up. And you can see all the water on the top, and then the clay is underneath. So we want to go ahead and make sure all the water is mixed in. So I'll go back to my drill and add this attachment. And I'll just mix this up for a few minutes. There we go, just a few seconds and already looking much better. The other thing I want to do is kind of reach down on the bottom, make sure there isn't anything that's settled on the floor of the bucket. I only had that problem once, but it's something I check for now. All right, I've been doing that for a couple minutes. I think I will let it sit, and then we'll do it for a few more minutes. In terms of how long to mix up the slip, probably longer is better. You just want to make sure everything is nice and mixed together and running nice and smoothly. In terms of smooth, you can see the consistency here. This has been sitting for a while, so it may have lost some water, but it's got kind of a thick cream-like consistency. If you're really into the weeds, you can measure how dense your slip is, and you can measure its viscosity as well. I haven't really bothered. If you're doing production pots or you're having problems with slip casting, you might try that out. If it's just working like it's been for me, I just go with it. And basically by experience and feel, I'll add more water. I try and do that very little. You want your slip kind of as dry as possible in terms of water content. You might want to add some more deflocculant if you're using Darvan 7. If you're using sodium silicate, that's much more touchy. I gave up on it very quickly and switched over to Darvan since it's much more tolerant. Next up, we need our plaster slip casting molds. Here are a bunch of my molds. These are all made out of plaster, and I have shown on my channel how I make these. I will 3D print pieces, and often I'll surface finish them, and I'll use that as a mold. So for example, this 3D printed piece here made this mold here for a bowl. This is my software. It's called Shapecast. You can sign up. I have a link in the description. It lets you put in a 2D profile of the pot and lets you create revolved one-piece molds. So things like bowls or cups or mugs, basically you need a draft angle on them. And it removes all of the CAD work you would otherwise need to do to create 3D printed molds to pour plaster into. As I mentioned, I have several videos on my channel showing that off, but we're not going to do that today. We're just going to use the molds. So I have a bowl, I have a smaller bowl, I have a little cup. Going back a couple videos, this is my 12-ounce mug. I have some kind of giant tumbler forms, and then I have a taller, thinner tumbler form. And to go with this, also have my handle molds. So we'll pour slip in here, and it has the profile to make a handle. Those are also made using 3D printed parts, and those are also available on Shapecast if you're curious. One of the questions that I get from time to time in the comment section is if I need to use plaster, if I can use something else. And the answer really is yes, you need to use plaster. And in particular, you should probably use pottery plaster. People ask if I can use concrete or use concrete for the mold system. Probably not. If you want to try it, go ahead, but I don't have high expectations of that working. There's also different types of plaster itself. So this is a USG #1 pottery plaster. It's designed specifically for pottery applications. There's also a different type of plaster called hydrocal. Hydrocal is much stronger, but there are some downsides. The pottery plaster is unique in that it has a bunch of small little voids that will pull the water out of the slip. And that's basically a critical feature in terms of slip casting. I showed you the slip. It's very water-like. It doesn't have a lot of water, much less than you would think because of the deflocculant. And the role of the plaster is, one, to create the form itself, so the different shapes for our pots, but then it's also acting as a sponge. So just like this sponge here has a bunch of little holes in it, there's a bunch of tiny little holes inside of the pottery plaster that wind up sucking the water out and depositing the clay against the plaster, and that's actually what forms our pot. Kind of a related question I get relatively often is why can't I just pour the slip into a 3D printed mold? And it's basically the same answer. The 3D print has no way of absorbing the water. I've had slip in this bucket for a very long time now, and I'll get a little bit of a deposit on the walls, but the plastic basically doesn't do anything. If you poured slip into a plastic 3D printed part, you basically pour it in and you'd pour it out, and you'd have a little bit of residual slip on the walls, but not enough to form a pot, and it wouldn't dry like it would in plaster. And I mentioned hydrocal plaster as well. Part of the reason it's stronger is it has less of those pores in it, so it absorbs water less well. I think it probably still absorbs water some. And I had an interesting discussion with someone around mixing pottery plaster with hydrocal, basically to tune the parameters. That's definitely in the advanced mode. I haven't done anything like that. I use the pottery plaster basically straight out of the bag. In terms of mold prep, we don't need to do much. I want to make sure that there isn't any dry plaster inside the molds so it doesn't get into the pots. These are all extremely dry at this point. You can reuse your plaster molds, but usually it's a good idea to let them dry for a known amount. Because the plaster is acting like a sponge, if there's already water in it, it will be less good at acting as a sponge. There isn't room for the water to go to. So that means if you cast several times in a row, the thickness of your pots will change based upon how much water is already in there. So if you want consistent walls for your pots, it's a good idea to try and have the water content in your plaster relatively consistent as well. So one example of this is to slip cast, let your molds dry out for a day, slip cast the next day, let them dry out for another day. At that point, the water levels in your plaster molds are relatively even. Obviously, that's dependent upon weather. I'm doing this in my garage, so it's not climate controlled, and in the summer it's hot and things dry out faster, and in the winter it's cold and damp and less so. So there's some adjustment there. However, if you're just starting out and you don't really care about the consistency, you can go ahead and do it back to back or let it sit longer. Basically, it's just a bunch of experimenting. It really depends upon your molds, your forms, and your plaster, your weather, all these other things. The nice thing is that if you mess it up, you can just go ahead and reclaim it and do it again. At this point, the clay is basically infinitely recyclable. All right, so let's go ahead and clean up the molds. So actually, I'm just gonna use the dry sponge and wipe out the dry clay. If you were really good about this, you would actually clean up all of the clay when it was wet and you'd have your molds nice and pristine. So it depends on what type of potter you are. These are some of my oldest molds, and they're starting to show some degradation. Basically, the surface finish is getting kind of rough at this point. They still work, but it's not nearly as crisp as some of my new molds. I actually want to redesign this form and shrink it just a little bit. I have this as an example on the Shapecast website, and it was basically as big as I could get to fit on my printer. And, well, that's great. It's actually a really big tumbler. It's actually this one here. All right, and the handle, same thing. This face here and this face here mate together, so you want to make sure that there's nothing that will get in the way so they fit together. Make sure there isn't any dry clay stuck in here. And while there are some registration marks here, some notches as they're traditionally called, there's a little bit of play, so these can slide around just a little bit. That's because of the tolerances needed basically when creating these things. They'll get you close like that, but you really do want to spend a minute and go ahead and align it as good as you can. You can always fix it with a sponge afterwards or a fettling knife or carve it off, but doing a few seconds of work here is beneficial. This is my largest handle. And then the small one. This one's got a little bit of clay stuck on it from last time. All right, there we go. All the molds are basically ready to go. All right, let's check back with our slip again. All right, it's still looking pretty good. I'm gonna spend some more time mixing. Now let's go ahead and get everything ready so we can slip cast and pour the slip into the pots. So to do that, we need to go ahead and raise up the buckets. So I put the socket adapter back on, and now we need to do the opposite. My drill has a high and a low setting, and you want the low setting. Since this can get heavy, you want all the torque you can. I usually grab a mold. I want to be above this level here. All right, there we go. So now we don't need to lift up the bucket and pour things. We can basically get it at the right level, and that's the magic of having this jack down underneath. For a long time, I used buckets and poured things in, and this was one of those nice improvements. I looked at a slip table, and I don't use it enough, and they're really a pain in the ass to clean. When I saw the spigot bucket trick, I knew that was a good idea, but getting the level just right is tricky, and that's where the motorcycle jack comes into play. All right, so I have a piece of plastic. I had problems with slip drying out inside of the spigot here. And when I originally made this, people were concerned because it flexes around and it didn't have a good seal. The silicones held no problem, and the flexing isn't a problem. Probably a thicker walled bucket would be good, but no issues. But adding this piece of plastic here with a rubber band around it, the idea was that I would create a secondary seal so there would be less time for air to get in. It could stay wet longer. However, as I said, it's been several weeks, maybe close to a month since I've used this. So I wouldn't be surprised if we actually have some solid slip inside here. Especially since slip is thixotropic. Basically the way this works is there's a ball with a hole in it that turns back and forth. And when it's turned, that slip is captured. And so while I mix the slip on the inside, even if it isn't wet, since it's thixotropic, it's nice and thick. And it will take a second to come out. So I have a little tub here I'm going to use just to make sure the slip's running. There it goes, no problem. That's great. So next up is to fill up all these molds with slip. To start with, I'm going to do my handles. I want these to cast solid, so I want slip to be in them the longest. So I'll get a little bit of slip in this cup here. Go ahead and pour in. Fill it to the top. And I'm spilling down the side. All right, we'll top these off. Perfect. All right, I'll set these off to the side, clean up the slip I've spilled. Okay, next we can start filling the molds. I think I'm going to go from biggest to smallest so that I know how much slip I have left, although I don't have very many small molds. So these I can pour directly in, so just open the spigot. Can open it more or less. This is pretty big, so I don't open it all the way usually. We'll come up into the slip well. Don't overfill it, otherwise you have more mess. Move this off to the side. Another tip is to go ahead and strain this as you put it into your molds. That will get any little particulates out of your slip. My slip comes from the manufacturer in a pretty good state, so I haven't really had to worry about that too much. What do we got next? We'll do this tall tumbler form. I'm going to try and aim for the middle of the mold, although usually I'll get a little bit on the sides. Can leave an artifact if you're leaving your pots unglazed. And we still have a lot of slip left. The slip well is a feature that Shapecast adds automatically, just magically adds it in. If your molds don't have a slip well, you just want to fill your pots up to the top. What this does is creates an extra space for the slip, so as the water is absorbed, the level goes down, and it stays above the rim of the pot. Otherwise, you wind up with a little bit of a funky rim and you have to clean it up a little bit more. And I think we're actually going to have enough slip to do all of these. This is my 12-ounce mug. Small bowl. And my small little cup. And the slip level has dropped almost down to the spigot. But I had enough. That's great. And then I'm going to go ahead and spray some water up in here. Try and get as much of the clay out as possible. I'll go ahead and take my piece of plastic and rubber band and cover it back up so it doesn't dry out. Perfect. So all the molds are full and the water is being absorbed by the plaster. Usually I will let my mold sit for 25 to 30 minutes. However, I get two of the same molds, and one of the questions people ask is, how do I know how long to let it sit? And the answer is really experimentation. I'm gonna let one of these go for another like 12 minutes, like half the time, and we'll pour the slip out and we can check the wall thickness versus letting it sit the full time. My walls are reasonably thick, although I've definitely seen pots with much thinner walls and much thinner walls. So I kind of shoot for somewhere in the middle. So let's come back in a few minutes and dump out the first pot. Okay, it's been about 10 minutes since I started slip casting, so we have another couple minutes before we pour this out. And the level of the slip is starting to go down. You can see that on a couple of these. It's most evident on the handles, which are hiding off to the side. These started pretty much full. And you can see how much the level's dropped. To get ready to dump out the slip, we need to go ahead and lower the table so I can reach the top of the bucket more easily. That way I don't have to lift the plaster molds full of slip as high. Go back down. I can muscle these around no problem, but the more I do so, the more likely there is slip to spill. So this one here has some iron oxide stains on it, so I'll use that as the marker. So we'll go ahead and take this and dump it out. So let's pick it up. Pour it all out. And there we go. There's still a little bit of slip in here, so I'm going to turn this upside down and let it drain longer. I'm going to do that on my homemade slip table, which I'll show you in a second. Here's my slip drainage table. This is inspired by a real slip table, so it's got a bunch of horizontal members here and the space for things to dry. In a real slip table, all that would drain and go basically straight back into the liquid slip. Here I just let it dry out, and eventually I'll break this out and turn it back into my reclaim. Here's the pot we just did, so it's been upside down for a minute. Got a bit of an artifact here, and that's because I waited to show you the pot. Basically, you want to turn this upside down as soon as possible. However, at this point, all of the liquid slip is set, and we can move it off to the side. The drainage table served its purpose, which is good because I think we're going to need the space for the rest of the molds. And it's been another 10 minutes, so we can start dumping them out and draining them. So that's the one to go for our test for time. All right, there we go. These can go ahead and drain and fully set up. Our handle molds are still working away. There's still liquid slip in those, so we're just going to let these cast solid. Move things around. So I'll go ahead and drain these when I go ahead and trim these pots. I usually let these sit for another 25 or 30 minutes just so that they have time to set up. This really depends upon, again, your plaster, but also the form. Some of them will want to slide out sooner, so you'll need to turn them right side back up. Okay, it's been about 25 minutes total. I went ahead and put away my slip drainage table. I just dumped out the remaining slip from the handles so that they're not too wet when we go to attach them. Next, we want to trim the pots and go ahead and demold them. For this, I like using my banding wheel, but you can just do this manually, and sometimes I just do that as well. And I have a razor blade here. Basically, I go down at a diagonal till I touch the slip well and then around. You don't want to dig into the plaster. You can feel it pretty easily. Let's pull that up. And this I just throw into a bucket of reclaim I have back behind me. And this one's our test spot, and the wall is indeed pretty thin. And as I mentioned, we have this artifact here from when I was showing you. I'll take a sponge and see if I can clean this up real quick. Well, it's still pretty soft. All right, there we go. On the associated pot. All right, there are all the pots. We still have the handles to do, but I'm going to see if I can go ahead and pull some of these out. Sometimes these are ready, and sometimes it takes a little bit longer for them to dry a little bit more and release from the mold. Again, that depends upon the water content of the mold and your slip. It depends upon the weather and how fast they're drying. And it also depends upon the shape of the pots, and maybe even how you mixed up the plaster and the porosity of the plaster. So usually I'll check right around now and see if they're ready. If not, I'll let them dry a little bit longer. And worst comes to worst, I use a little bit of air to get them out. So some of these are looking good already. So this one you can see how it's pulled away, and trimming distorts that a little bit. I use a piece of cardboard to help catch, so just put that down. Give it a quick shake and it comes straight out. And I need a wear board. Just gently pick it up and move it over. And you'll notice some of my molds actually have marks on it. I've started counting the number of times I've used it, so I just marked this one off camera. So I've used this one 11 times. I'm curious about how long they last. I really don't know. I have some guesses, but I think it'd be good to count. So if you wanted to use this again, the recommended advice would be, as I mentioned earlier, to go ahead and basically let it wait for 24 hours. That way the dampness can basically move through the plaster and evaporate some, and then you have a nice consistent water level. I have slip cast these back to back, but the timing is off. As I mentioned, you basically have to let it sit longer because this is already a little bit wet. Let's see if this bowl is ready. Nope, not yet. And I don't see it released at all, so we'll set this to the side. The big bowl. Yep, no problem. This one will actually fit on my wear board, so I need to put it behind me. This would be a great time to sponge down your molds, make sure there isn't any excess clay on them. Something I usually forget to do. This one's looking ready. Find the right size cardboard. I often would just palm these. I can catch them pretty easily. However, if you distort the rim at this point, the clay memory, the realignment of the particles will kick in and you can wind up with warped pots. These are all handmade, so that adds a little bit of character, but if you want them nice and clean, be very careful of deforming them at this stage. There we go. I'll try this one. This one usually hangs on a little bit. Yeah, it's not ready yet. Although it's really close. I think I can get it. There we go. All right, and the large tumbler. This one looks like it's going to come. No problem. And the one with the thin walls, this one's looking less promising at this point, but we'll give it a shot. Yeah, not yet. So these two I'm going to give a little bit while longer, basically let them dry out a little bit more and release from the sides. Let's go ahead and demold the handles. So these should just come apart. Be very gentle. There we go. So we got a little bit of flash, but that cleans up really easily, I found. I'm going to go ahead and clean off the mold though. These you definitely don't want clay to build up on. All right, then we can gently pull these out. Just like that. You can see most of the flash remain behind, and even what's left is very thin. I've been using an X-Acto knife to trim these, so just cut off the excess clay. More reclaim. There we go on the handles. And you can see they indeed cast solid. All right, let me go ahead and rearrange things so we can go ahead and attach the handles and see if the other pots will come out. And I'll do a little bit of cleaning as well. So while we have easy access, I like to go ahead and deal with the flash. Sponge it off. could also let this set up firmer and trim it off with a knife. Many options. All right, this tiny handle here, I'm going to put on to this small cup. And I've got a slight defect in the mold, so I'm putting the handle on that side. Just clean the defect up a little bit. And the handle will go right there. But you'll notice that the curves don't match, so we actually need to trim the handle a little bit more. Basically, we want to cut in the curve that matches the pot, or something relatively close. It's already getting a little bit stiff, so probably could have pulled it a little bit sooner. I think that looks pretty good. So if you want, you can slip and score, or I usually just slip, but as I mentioned, this is getting a little bit firm, so we'll go ahead and score it. Just get some slip right on my bucket, put it on. Same thing. And my pot, I think, is still wet enough, so I should be good. Go ahead and align that where I want it. Give it a little push. Be careful not to break anything. And I like adding some extra slips to fill in this gap. All right, just like that, stuck on. I'll let this sit up a little bit more and then clean it up a little bit. We'll set it off to the side in the meantime. So I think for the 12-ounce mug, we'll use this handle. This one didn't quite cast solid, but by the time we trim it, I think it'll be solid again. We're down that far. Alright, same thing, slip around, or if you have a compatible clay, you can put a little coil of clay there. Let that set and firm up. I'm going to put on this tall tumbler, and you can decide, do you want your handle straight up and down, or do you want it leaning with the form? If you want it straight up and down, you just trim it a little bit more. I think I'm going to go ahead and let it lean with the form. Decide where we want it. Push it down, be careful not to deform the pot. All right, there we go. It is also attached. Now let's see if the other pots will come out now. Oh, perfect, no problem. All right, this one's still a little bit stuck, so I'll use a little bit of air assist. You can just let it dry a little bit longer, but I'm gonna get it to release. I think that's partially because this mold is degrading. The surface is, as I mentioned, rough, so it's holding on tighter than it normally would. So I've got an air compressor in my garage and just hook up this air gun. If you're gonna use air, be very gentle. It's very easy to deform the pot. I really just wanna use it to release. I want to be extra careful with this one since it's the one with the very thin walls. There it goes. So the air basically got underneath and pushed everything up. Since the air had to go somewhere, it moved the pot for me. And just like that. This one again, I'll be very gentle with. And you can see here all these little spots. Here's basically little micro bubbles that were probably just under the surface of the plaster, or they're just being eroded away as I slip cast. Plaster molds do not last forever, which is why I'm counting on the other ones, just to see how long they do last. So now let's go ahead and deal with the rims of the pots. You want to make sure they're firm enough. So I like taking a damp sponge, just going around and breaking the edges basically, and dealing with any artifacts from cutting off the slip well. Let that dry for a second. If you have any imperfections in the pot, this is a good time to catch them too. Again, you want to be very careful not to deform the pot at this point. If you do, you'll wind up with a warped form once it's fired, most likely. All right, there are our new pots. And for the handle molds, I went ahead and sponged them off and put them back together so they can dry. So these are good to go for next time. And if you had more molds, you could go ahead and fill them back up and do the same thing over and over again. That's basically all my molds, so I'm gonna have to wait till tomorrow to do that. It's warm right now, and I don't want these to dry out too fast, especially the pots with the handles. We got the solid cast piece, the pot, and then the slip that I added. I'm gonna let these firm up a little bit more until they're a little bit harder, leather hard, and then I will sponge off the connection points and the seam as well. So I just take a piece of plastic, cover them up loosely. You can use cloth, depends upon basically your climate. Here it's pretty warm, so they would dry out pretty fast if I didn't cover them at this point. In the winter, not so much. So I'll come back in a few hours when I clean up the handles and I can show you what our slip cast pots look like. It's actually been more than a few hours. It's the end of the day and the pots are drying out nicely. I came out a couple of times and went ahead and cleaned up the handles a little bit more. So we have a nice good seam, and I cleaned up the seam line from casting the handle itself. She's looking good. A little bit of evaporation from the water, with one exception. This one here, when I was working on it, I accidentally squeezed it and it deformed the pot. And don't try and save this. You can push it back, but again, the clay particles got realigned. It's gonna fire and be wonky. So I kind of gave up on that. I just want to show it to you. Just make a new one tomorrow. It's the beauty about slip casting. Making the pots themselves is relatively easy. So if one doesn't work out, just throw it in the reclaim. However, the rest of them are in really good shape. The other thing I want to show you is the two pots that we made out of the same mold that are different wall thicknesses. So can you guess which one we left in for 12 minutes and which one we left in for 25? This one is significantly thinner. This one's not all that thick. And of course, these will continue to shrink. As they dry, the clay will shrink, and then when we fire it, it will shrink some more. So this wall is going to be super thin, but I think it's actually going to be fun. I might try experimenting with my wall thickness a little bit more. A while ago, I was at a ceramics show and experienced a whole bunch of different pots. And one of the ones I wound up buying had some really thin walls, and that was just very interesting. Most of the pots that I handle are my own. I do have a few others that I purchased, but this one was definitely pushing the thin side. So I think it might be fun to try that a little bit more. And with that, I'll go ahead and cover these up and let them continue to dry out slowly. Really, the key is drying evenly. The speed of the drying doesn't really matter, but drying slowly makes drying evenly easier. People often ask me how long it takes me to make a pot and have a really hard time answering. I made all of these, including the handles, in the video that I just showed you. And of course, I was filming that as well. Maybe an hour or two's worth of work, I'm able to make a half dozen pots. However, if I made one pot, it would basically be the same as making 10 if I had the 10 molds. And if I didn't have handles, it would go much faster. So that's how we go from slip that's been sitting for a little too long, mixing it up, cleaning the plaster molds to make sure we don't have any dust or clay stuck in them, pouring the slip, making a couple of handles to go with it, letting the slip sit in the plaster mold and the water absorbed into the plaster mold so the pots are formed, dumping out the excess slip, letting it dry a little bit more, pulling the pots out, and then attaching our handles. We then sponge them off a little bit and let them dry. From here on out, basically these are treated as any other pot, just like one that you threw. Goes bone dry, you bisque it, we'll glaze it, glaze fire it, and then we'll have some brand new pots. However, that will be a future video. In the meantime, if you have any questions or comments, let me know. Thanks.